Welcome to the latest edition of the MBN Iran podcast. Today we have as our guest Dana Stroul of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Matt Kaminski, the editorial chair at MBN. I want to ask you, basically start right off with this really significant piece that you had published in Foreign Affairs last week. And it raises a lot of questions about kind of U.S. in the Middle East, the war, and kind of where are we going with this. And you have some pretty moving quotes. I'll start off with, you said the U.S. simply cannot afford to fight another war like this one. And I want to ask you about that. What is it about this particular war that is so compelling in that way that the country can't afford to do this again?
Well, thanks for highlighting that essay and the question. One element of the war that we saw the United States and Israel fight this year that I was particularly interested in is the economics of warfare. And we've actually had some glimpses of the changing nature of warfare from what has been going on in the European theater between Russia and Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how Ukrainian forces have adapted tactics, techniques, and procedures like drone warfare in order to save their forces' lives and actually take the war inside Russia. And we've been concerned for a long time, actually, that the ways in which Russia was innovating and using its missiles, and particularly its drones, against Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian civilian infrastructure would ultimately migrate over into the Middle East. And that's exactly what we saw this year. So, in short, there were two main elements of this war that I don't think the U.S. military can afford to fight again this way in the future. The first is that we surged an incredible amount of capability into the Middle East on a very short time frame. There were two and at points three aircraft carrier groups, huge numbers of fighter squadrons, and then all of the logistical support for that kind of air and sea power, refuelers, extra fuel for these things, U.S. forces, medical, food, all the things to sustain your forces. We call it sustainment and maintenance. Huge amount that surged into the Middle East and then forward from Europe and other places to support that fighting force in the Middle East. And then number two, a huge amount of munitions. So both the munitions expenditures for the campaign, the offensive inside Iran, but also the defensive side. Given how the Iranian regime reacted, the ballistic missile volleys and the drone swarms that came across the Middle East, targeting not just U.S. military bases and not just Israel, but Gulf and Jordanian civilian areas, civilian infrastructure. What we could see is that the Iranians were innovating in the way they used low-cost drones and other things, and what we were using to defend ourselves and what our Gulf partners and Israel and Jordan were using were high-end, really expensive systems, multi-million-dollar missile defense interceptors coming from Patriots and THAAD batteries, other U.S. origin air defense. And what the Iranians were using is a couple $100,000 drones. So economically, given what we have expended to defend ourselves and fight this war, given how hard it is going to be for U.S. defense industry to replenish all of these things, the cost equation of the kinds of forces and to not achieve strategic ends, and then the kind of war we just fought has implications not just for the Middle East, but for how we might need to fight in other theaters like Asia Pacific. And so, in short, looking at all those factors and the economics of the changing nature of warfare, the U.S. military is going to need to update and adapt how it fights in the future.
So I'm going to be asking you about a couple of points that you raised there, including especially the Tomahawk issue and the replacement rate. But let's go back to the beginning, right? You highlight as well, uh, the goals were well, four things, let's say: regime surrender, liberation of the Iranian people, eliminating Iran's regional influence, and getting a better nuclear deal. So can you say that, I guess you would argue, these weren't achieved? What was achieved?
Well, one of the things I wanted to highlight in the piece is that if you listen to our U.S. military leaders and to President Trump, they really focused on quantitative metrics to assess the war. We struck this many targets. We dropped this many pounds of munitions. We had this many fighter squadrons, all of these different things. But at a strategic level, President Trump's objectives, as he laid them out, switched repeatedly throughout the war. And now the other part of this, I think, is really important, as you point out. The U.S. policy about Iran, what we have generally identified as the problematic areas of behavior, are three: Iran's nuclear program, Iran's missile program, and Iran's support for terrorists and proxies across the Middle East, but frankly, much further than just the Middle East. And Iran, looking at the conventional metrics that, President Trump lists: we sunk their navy, we eliminated their air force, we destroyed their military industrial complex, we pushed back their nuclear program. That might be true, but the Iranian regime recognized very early on that the way to respond for them to ensure their survival was not to match the United States at a conventional level. It was to respond asymmetrically. And that's what the economics of war and the drone response was. But most importantly, the Iranians added a fourth element to their power projection, the ways in which they seek to influence the Middle East. And that was by preventing free flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. And that, I think, gets to where we are today with this MOU and whether or not anything was accomplished. Because clearly, by reading this MOU, the Iranians only had to commit to open the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days. They have made no other commitments with respect to their nuclear program other than to have negotiations about the nuclear program over the 60 days. They had to make no commitments with respect to the missile program or the support for terrorism. And just for opening the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days, to be determined what happens after those 60 days, and to make a commitment to continue to discuss the nuclear program, they're receiving a huge economic windfall through the sanctions relief that they're getting in this MOU. So at a strategic level, whatever the United States and President Trump said at the beginning is not what we have achieved, looking at how the table is set right now. The Iranians could rebuild their nuclear program. They could choose to rebuild their missile program.
But it's striking to me that yes, Iran has surprised us by showing how much leverage it does have, that leverage we didn't see. But then but if you widen the aperture here and widen it over the last 3 years and say, Iran has been set back, has had significant setbacks, and it is in a far weaker position now than it was on, let's just say, October 8th, 2023, and the campaign that Israel's campaign against its leadership, the bombing last summer, this campaign. Yes, we oversold what was possible. We didn't fully engage with our Gulf partners, but Iran doesn't have to be a stronger player in the region unless we let it be, because Iran has no navy now. People always invoke the JCPOA, that the Obama administration signed with Iran as well. That was better than what we have now. But if we had stuck with that, it would be running out now anyway, that we wouldn't have the leverage that we seem to have to negotiate something better with them. So I wonder if we ourselves are not being a little bit overly myopic about, oh, what a debacle, because it was sold as A and we got B. But B is the outcome, really. I think it's not a foregone conclusion that it's a strategic failure for the U.S. unless we let it be that.
Fair. I think 2 points in response to that. The first is, I agree with you. We need to think about what we saw this year in this Iran war in 2026 on a broader scale, and really think about how military force has been used since October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel. And what we broadly have seen, Israel use its military force to degrade Hamas in Gaza for a ceasefire, to be determined whether that actually results in Hamas's disarmament. It did degrade Hezbollah in Lebanon to an extent that there was a ceasefire in November 2024 on terms quite favorable to Israel. But yet again, we see that actually there has been an inability to transition those military achievements into a sustainable or meaningful political outcome. It's true that with different kinds of military force, not specifically after October 7th, Bashar al-Assad is no longer in Syria. We can imagine a different future for Syria, and actually Israeli officials and Syrian officials have been negotiating for that potential outcome. There's been significant military engagements with the Houthis in Yemen, yet they actually remain in position. There may or may not be some transition of the militias in Iraq that have held Iraq back. And then at a broader level, this year was actually the fourth time there's been interstate war. There was one in April 2024 when there was this big multilateral air defense coalition. There was October 2024. There was the 12-day war in 25. And then what we had, Epic Fury in 2026. And it wasn't until Epic Fury that we saw Iran respond in the way it did. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's fair that there have been many ways in which the Iranian threats have been pushed back. But we know from how many decades of involvement in the Middle East that nothing ends exclusively with military force. And I think the challenge of the moment that we're in now is whether or not the United States can transition those military achievements into sustainable political commitments and outcomes. And when I read this MOU, I don't see the U.S. administration negotiating like it's a winner. I actually see it giving really significant concessions up front and the Iranian regime not obligated to change its behavior. And so the groundwork is potentially laid for a resurgence of that malign influence.
Right, because we're driven here in the U.S. by domestic considerations, the fuel price, the midterms, whereas, you know, to prevent a strategic defeat, you actually need to think strategically. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time in the region just before the war when there was concern about this, and I know how unhappy they are since the war, but it hasn't broken the American alliance with these countries. But they are starting to hedge more. They are starting to think about, you know, maybe China isn't so bad. Maybe you cannot rely on the U.S., which is really dangerous if you want to throw your weight around the world. So even though I do think Iran has emerged militarily weaker, I do think it's exposed some weaknesses of our approach that we can blow up things really, really well, but it doesn't necessarily get us to the outcome we want. But the greater danger, it seems to me, is actually that you might end up with a post-American Middle East, and a Middle East where American influence longer term it declines unless this next period is managed, let's say, better than in the last 3 months have been managed.
I think the paradox of this moment is that at a military level, we've actually seen these heights, these peaks of U.S. military involvement in what military leadership can do. First of all, the United States and Israel together did this war, and it's an unprecedented level of combined military operations. And we saw partners in the Gulf and Jordan intercept Iranian missile and drone attacks at a rate of somewhere between 87 to 89%. That's pretty good. It's really remarkable. That's U.S. origin equipment, U.S. training, U.S. intelligence, U.S. support. The 13% that got through was devastating, and I want to acknowledge the trauma for civilians and societies and the damage to their energy infrastructure. But 87% is not bad. And I think the other part here is that the U.S. military continued to serve as the integrator throughout this whole war. So these countries would not have been able to sustain this level of defense without the United States. And for now, the United States will remain the military backbone in the Middle East. But I agree, Matt, at the political level, what countries in the Middle East, governments and leaders in the Middle East feel is whiplash from Washington, D.C., because the policy pronouncements, the constant social media, the feeling that the policy objectives are changing on a continuous basis is really challenging when these countries need to recover from the devastation of this war. They want stability and calm in their society so that they can start to rebuild, have a more predictable environment for business and commerce. And that's not what this period feels like.
And you pointed out, again, going back to your article, that there was a time when Iran attacked a UAE oil terminal, and basically the U.S. didn't do anything about it. And I think there have been a number of examples where they're really concerned. One of the other concerns that you raised that I want to touch on is you mentioned the 1,000+ Tomahawk missiles that were fired, and the replacement rate is what, 90 to 100 a year. That's pretty scary, right, for the next war. A country as powerful as the U.S. is in such a short time using so much of its arsenal, and we can't even replace it after a relatively, this is not a full-scale war that we were in.
I agree. It's a really significant amount of Tomahawk missiles that were used. So it is important here to note that we don't know what the actual existing stockpiles that the U.S. military still has. Those are classified. as they should be. But it is also true that U.S. defense industry has been struggling to produce at an acceptable rate for both U.S. military requirements and our partners. And of course, we've been on war footing supporting Ukraine after the Russia invasion since 22, supporting Israel since October 7, 2023, and obviously before that, but at an increased rate after that. And the U.S. military has been engaged in or supporting these conflicts. So, tremendous drawdown from our own stocks. And this is where there's tremendous pressure and focus on U.S. defense industry, how to speed up production. Are there areas for new partnerships, co-development, pooled funding? And this is one of the things about it, to not lose the moment, to not be in a post-American Middle East. The United States is going to need to find new ways of cooperating with its partners who actually want to be producing and want to be partners, and how we think about responding to the changing nature of warfare and how we better defend ourselves in the future, knowing how Iran responds. And so I think this gets to some of Matt's point about things we need to be doing differently now to not have these partnerships further erode.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost inconceivable to imagine another Middle East war in this Trump term. I think he will, we might go into Cuba, but I can't imagine a war at this scale, for better and for worse. There's the Asian theater, which gets worried about Taiwan, obviously. I think the greater challenge for me is really more the diplomatic one going forward. Is like, how does the U.S. maintain its position in the Middle East, and how do the key Middle Eastern countries think about their relationship with the U.S., and whether that will really start to change?
I agree, and I imagine, I'm thinking about the height of President Trump's visit to the Middle East last
Of
year.
course, the first one, yeah,
The
yeah.
first one, so he goes to Saudi Arabia,
It's a
the
big plane.
UAE, and Qatar. He gets a fancy new plane as well. But the real focus there was on the future of these partnerships. It wasn't about security and it wasn't about the military. It was about AI, commercial, business, and of course that follows a lot of work that was done in the previous administration, renewable energy, food security, that basically the partnerships, particularly in the Gulf, are not only about the Middle East and what we can do in the Middle East. It's also about what the Middle East can do in the United States, and together what we can do beyond the Middle East, whether it's Africa, Europe, Asia, joint investments. And I do think that this is a unique moment to see whether, as there is testing of the proposition that this might be a transformational moment with the right amount of skill, diplomacy, and investment, get back to some of the goals about where these partnerships were going before, which is, again, commerce, people to people, education, AI, these sorts of issues.
But I think you're going to see that the challenge to that is those. Maybe that's fine with the U.S. bilateral relationships, but even though the Gulf, in some ways, was brought together by this attack, uh, you have very different responses. I mean, the Emirates they're doubling down on the alliance with Israel and the U.S. The Saudis seem much more open to trying to use the Pakistanis to let's make up with the Iranians. The Chinese, they seem like pretty good partners for us increasingly. The Qataris have very different views on this, and they're livid about what happened to their gas fields and others, and so and then I guess I think there's a lot of work to do there. And I don't know if that region is going to sort of start to feel a little bit more fractured than it did before this. And then what happens with Iran if that regime is now younger and more radical than it was before? So this talk about, we can better integrate Iran in the region, I think by that, the Iranians probably think, let's start to recreate some of our proxy networks to cause some trouble in the region, because that's what we know how to do. And maybe there's an opening to try and for them to come back as a sort of a bad actor again.
Well, first of all, I think at this point it's hard to think about the Gulf as a monolith in any way, because I
Right.
agree with you. There's been such a diversity of responses. And the trajectory of the UAE and its foreign policy approach, not just its doubling down on the Abraham Accords and Israel, but it withdrew from OPEC Plus, it's charting its own path.
Mhm.
Saudi, same thing. Oman, in quite a different place, actually hasn't even joined on to the statements coming out of the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council throughout the entire war, actually welcomed visits from members of the Iranian regime during the war, even after Oman was struck. And then you have smaller Gulf states in the middle. Qatar, obviously, at this moment in time, its mediation greatly valued by the Trump administration. And there was talk about incentives for Iran in a post-war region even before this MOU that came out. What's interesting about this moment in time is that the Trump administration is essentially endorsing or opening the door to Gulf reparations for Iran. It's a recovery fund, but it's reparations. And I think there was a view during the war that given the Iranian response punishing Gulf countries, this would encourage most Gulf
Mm.
countries to double down and align with the United States. And we saw that defensively. There are obviously some reports that some Gulf countries partook in specific offensive operations after they were targeted. But in general, it seems like at this moment, many of the Gulf countries are concluding from this that they need to raise the stakes for Iran to attack them again by incorporating them more, by much more than the previous rapprochement, by involving them in the commercial life and fabric of the Middle East. And so now there's talk about some sort of summit between Iran and the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, that there should be more open channels. And this, I think, will make it more difficult for the United States if it wants to keep pressure on Iran for things like the nuclear file, the missile file, or getting it to stop training and funding and arming non-state actors across the region.
Mm.
Is there any, as far as I understand, you were the top civilian in the Defense Department working on the Middle East a few years ago. Uh, could we have foreseen this? Is there something that lessons for the future? Basically, what are the lessons? Lessons from what led up to this, lessons from how the past few months have happened. Uh, how does the US come off kind of on the plus side after this war with limited leverage as well?
It's a really important question. So I will say one of the most important things that you do as a defense policy official in the Pentagon is you make sure that the president has credible military options for whatever the threat is. So in my case, in my time in the Pentagon, President Biden spoke about preferring diplomacy to address U.S. concerns with Iran, but always being prepared to use military force should diplomacy fail. And our job in the Pentagon was to make sure there were credible military options. And we did that job. So that's number one. Number two is when you think about military options, the reasons that they might not deliver the strategic outcome one wants were a couple. One is you might actually convince the leaders of Iran to double down on needing the nuclear weapon to prevent getting attacked in the future. Two is that there is no military option that can completely eliminate the entire nuclear program, including the knowledge of nuclear scientists inside Iran. So there's no clean military option that just eliminates it and makes it go away forever. And three is what the Iranian response might be. And there was always awareness that the Iranian response could be anything from attacking U.S. military bases, attacking Israel, raining down ballistic missiles on the entire Middle East, unleashing its drones, or trying to close the Strait of Hormuz. All of those were options that were well understood throughout all of my years in the Pentagon when we were making sure that there were credible military options. You always want to be prepared to brief your bosses on the risks of using those military options, and those were on the table. Second point is that in the post-October 7th period, a lot of the worst case scenarios didn't actually play out. So when Israel put so much pressure on Hezbollah in Lebanon from early October 2023 until recently, despite the consistent Israeli military pressure, Hezbollah was not able to rain down missiles on Israel in a way that completely challenged Israel's society. The Israel Defense Forces were able to protect Israel and Israeli citizens the entire time. We had, again, April 24, October 24, and the 12-day war in 25, where there was interstate war, and it didn't escalate to World War III. We didn't have missiles raining down on the entire Middle East. So all of these ways, I think, sent a signal to the current administration that the worst case scenarios weren't playing out. And actually, quite a lot could be achieved with military force. And again, those worst case scenarios didn't play out. But I think the lesson of this year, it was very apparent to me within the first 24 hours of the Israeli and U.S. military operations that it was not about the nuclear program, the missile program, or the terrorist program. It was about regime collapse. And it was about regime collapse, and the minute Iran's leaders understood that this was existential and about their survival, they unleashed everything that was the worst case scenario. And that is how we got to ballistic missiles raining down across the entire Middle East, not only at Israel, and that is how we got to a Strait of Hormuz closure. And now we have a situation, as Matt noted from before, this regime has survived, and for them, survival is victory, and they are more hardened by that experience, and they have stood up to the United States and Israel, and that is going to shape and inform their behavior going forward.
I want to ask you about the Houthis. I know you've written a lot about the Houthis, and if I understand correctly, your argument is that they're not actually a group that can just be turned on and shut off by Iran. That they actually pose a much greater threat, even possibly a kind of North Korea style threat. So, they've been left off the agenda, and yet they're clearly going to be a part of the agenda in the future in the region. Can you talk us through that? Kind of where could that go, especially since they're not being talked about, but they're still there.
The interesting element of the Houthis is that they're less a proxy of Iran and more of a partner. The Iranians invested a tremendous amount in developing the Houthis, giving them certain capabilities and technical know-how. And now the Houthis are self-sustaining, and they essentially have a very strong governance position in Yemen. And I should note here, the Iranian playbook for turning off traffic in the Strait of Hormuz was perfected by the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandeb in the Red Sea after October 7, 2023. And actually, at that time, the United States military put together a defensive maritime coalition. There were offensive military strikes. The Europeans put together their own mission, all in the Red Sea. And none of them actually dislodged the Houthis from their position inside Yemen. And we know even today the Houthis still have missiles and other weapons capable of targeting, if they can target Israel, they can target other places in the Middle East. And the challenge I think about the Houthis is one, whether or not they would choose to step up on behalf of the Iranian regime, why they did not, they did after October 7th, but not in some of these other direct military confrontations over the past 3 years, what they're waiting for now, and a Houthi calculation as to whether entering the war and escalating against the United States and Israel at this moment in time gets them do they lose more by doing that or by retaining their governance position and staying quiet in Yemen? And right now, it's very clear if you're Saudi Arabia and you're trying to restore calm so that you can get focused on Vision 2030 again, you don't want noise coming out of Tehran, but you also don't want noise coming out of Yemen. And that's why the Saudis this entire time have remained committed to this dialogue and this process with the Houthis to determine a way forward for Yemen.
Yeah, I think this kind of this remarkable thing is that the status quo of February 15th or sort of February 26th in the Middle East, you ask anyone in the region, maybe you ask anyone here in Washington and put them on truth serum, they would say, yes, we would go back to that because it was economically vibrant. It was a trade and business crossroads. It was relatively, Iran had been weakened and contained. And the open question now that the war is over, we can say now the war is over, the odds of it restarting again are fairly low. You don't know what kind of nuclear deal you're going to have. But the real question is, can you get back to the region that you described earlier of, we're talking about data centers, about the youth bulge, about, tech investments, about, Saudi modernization? Or is the status quo has been so disturbed, Iran is not contained? Even though it's weakened militarily, it is stronger in terms of its perceived power in the region than it was before February. And I think the challenge for Arab policymakers as well as Washington is how do you make sure that perception doesn't stick, and to kind of really try and say, because this was a win for Israel and the U.S. before this last military engagement began, and now it's seen as a loss. It's seen as a loss by the Israeli electorate, and we'll see how Bibi fares in a few months. And it's certainly seen as a loss here in Washington. I mean, both among Republicans and Democrats. But nothing's ever set in stone in the Middle East. So I guess we can see how it really plays out. I mean, that's the next interesting game here. It'll be less visible because it won't be sort of top headline news anymore. But
I agree with you. And I think we're in a moment, and this is just another chapter in the story. This is not the end of the story. We are still in a post-October 7th Middle East. And I think what happens next in Gaza with Hamas disarmament, in Lebanon, whether or not Hezbollah disarms, whether Syria stabilizes, what happens with the Houthis, all of this will have implications for, again, whether we can get back to that bigger conversation about the Middle East beyond the Middle East, which is really where U.S. policy, I think, was going with its partners, especially in the Arab world and Israel before this war. The challenge, I think, about perceptions is that I'm listening to the Trump administration say certain things about the potential transformation of the region after this war and Iran's role in the region. And I'm listening to Iranian leaders talk about absolutely not. This is not, that we are victorious here. This is a moment in time, and let's see if the Americans. But you just have to read the MOU.
yeah,
The MOU very clearly gives Iran a role in the region. They are giving Iran a seat at the table over what happens in Lebanon. Unprecedented to see the United States do that. And the MOU gives Iran a role in the future administration of the Strait of Hormuz. It says that Iran can work that out with Oman and the Gulf littoral states over the 60 days to determine what happens after these 60 days. And so I think we have to think not about can we go back to status quo ante, but there's a new regional order, there's a new navigational order, and that messy workout of what this looks like is exactly what we're seeing now. So there's foreign ministers, I believe, from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt meeting maybe yesterday, maybe today. We see other regional groupings. There's these rumors of some sort of Gulf Iran summit. All of these are the nascent beginnings of conversations about what that post-war regional order looks like.
Which, as you said, is neither safer nor it's not safer or more stable or more prosperous, but we can hope for the best. Just one last thing. 60 days, actually, the clock has already started ticking. If you were in the room there with the American team, what's the one thing you'd be telling them to watch out for and insist on, and kind of the one major point you would want to make to them?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the most important point is that the United States, in my view, has made some very important commitments that should address Iranian concerns in the MOU. This MOU is much more concessionary and favorable to Iran than it is the reverse. But we have demonstrated now repeatedly, the United States, that it can surge military force into the region. It can deliver massive military blows. It can take down your air defense. It can deliver precise targeting, and it can really undermine whatever the possibilities for recovery are in Iran. And for Iran's leaders to survive, they need breathing room. They need economic opportunities to recover. And so the last thing they want to do is continue testing the United States. So I think the most important point that American leaders need to be able to make is that they always retain the potential and possibility of turning the military options back on, and that a credible threat of military force, unfortunately, is needed and necessary for hard-nosed diplomacy.
Well, on that brilliant note, Dana Stroul, Matt Kaminski, thank you for a really enlightening half hour together.